Hi everyone, and thank you for joining us for this webinar, the first one of World Childless Week 2022. I'm joined by some amazing ladies, some incredibly patient ladies after me having a hiccup trying to get this damn webinar working. But they're here today to talk about therapy as a therapist, the highs, the lows, and all the insights in between. So I'm not a therapist, so I'm going to pose a couple of questions that hopefully you lot can brainstorm between you and answer and give us all some insights. But first of all, you know yourselves better than everyone else. Everybody loves to hear from you. So can I ask you all to give a sort of individual introduction of who you are and your history with therapy? So if we'd like to start, I'll go around the screen. Cristina.
Yeah, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with such amazing panelists. And okay, so I'm based in Norway. I'm originally from Italy, and I'm author of Childlessness in the Age of Communication, Deconstructing Silence, where I explored the silence around infertility. And also I talked about the many dimensions of not having children, not just the medical one, but especially the existential, the one related to relationship, identity, all domains of life. I'm also co-founder with Cecilia Hoxmark here in Norway of the first organization for the permanently childless called Andre Veier, which in Norwegian means other ways. And I've been training as a psychotherapist, and those women receive the help that now I'm about to qualify. I'm going to qualify early next year, but I'm working on my dissertation and now doing psychotherapy with 6 women.
Thank you, Cristina. I want to say it's obviously you came to me originally, came with a suggestion of doing a submission on therapy and therapists, which is what led to this webinar. So I'm grateful for you sort of starting this conversation as well. Jodie, can I come to you next, please?
Thank you. Thanks for hosting this panel, Steph, and thank you for not giving up on Zoom today. Well done. So I'm Jodie Day. I'm the founder of Gateway Women. I'm the author of this book, which I don't have with me because I'm not at home at the moment, which is called Living the Life Unexpected, How to Find Hope, Meaning and a Fulfilling Future Without Children. It is almost nearly 10 years old, my book. The first edition was crowdfunded and published in 2013. And actually, Muriel was one of the people that helped crowdfund that publication. So we go back a long way. And I am an integrative psychotherapist, which means that I trained in quite a few different disciplines together. So I have like a broad mix of therapies. And I'm not currently seeing private clients, but I did spend a lot of time when I was living in England. I now live in Ireland, working with childless clients, and actually developed a slightly different way of working with them, which actually is slightly different from psychotherapy. We can talk a little bit more about that later. I found that it required a slightly unique, tailored approach, which I'm really looking forward to hearing what the others think about. So thank you.
Katie, would you like to go next, please?
Yes, hello, I'm thrilled to be here. I am in Seattle, Washington in the US, and I've been a psychotherapist since 2000, and I started my career working with children and their adults, and really just envisioned myself being a mom one day, and this was going to be my little niche. And I still do work with children, but my work with childlessness has grown throughout my career, and currently I am seeing a good mix of different types of clients, but really emphasizing childlessness right now. A lot of my clients are also very ambivalent and trying to decide, which is kind of an interesting addition to my, caseload. And another thing I'm involved in, I'm pretty passionate about helping other counselors and therapists understand more about childlessness, because I hear very often and know myself that it was really hard to find somebody who understood and was just baseline competent with the idea of childlessness. So I'm thrilled to be here.
Thank you. And last but by no means least, Muriel, would you like to share your story, please?
Hi, everybody. So yeah, my name is Muriel. I qualified as a counsellor in 2010 and started working with childless clients in 2019 after I completed a 1-year Plan B mentorship programme with Jodie. And one of the things that came out of that was she and I talking about working as a counsellor for childless clients, and I decided that that is what I wanted to do. So yes, in 2019, I saw my first childless client, which was very exciting. And since then, I've broadened my niche. So I do work with childless people, but I've also added to that, and I work with clients who are childless and LGBTQ, or childless and neurodiverse, or all three. So I really want to work with childless people who are also affected by other forms of difference, because I think that can complicate and make more difficult the experience of childlessness, or at least make it different. And I think it's really important to look at that as well. So all of my clients are childless, but some of them also have other differences, which are important to address and pay attention to. So I've really found it very valuable to be able to work with people who've experienced similar things to me. Our journeys are all completely unique, but similar things to me. We all ended up in a similar place, no matter how we got here. And like Katie, I really want to support other counsellors as well, counsellors with children. And I wrote an article a couple of years ago called 10 Things Your Childless Client Wants You to Know, which was aimed at counsellors with children to help them work more compassionately with clients without children.
Thank you. I think the first question I want to throw open to everybody to answer as and when they feel to just join into the conversation is something that Katie and Mary have both brought up on. It's the fact that it's educating the people who are quite often the ones who are helping you train and go through your qualifications, who you have to speak to on childlessness. And I'm guessing for a few of you, if not all of you possibly, that you encountered people who, first of all, didn't realise childlessness was a grief, and then weren't sure how exactly to go about supporting you with something they didn't understand. Can I come to you, Katie, with that one first? Then we'll just take it from there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, we're all trained in grief. We're all trained, in a lot of things that we feel like we can take and apply to every client that we're going to see. And it turns out that childlessness is vastly misunderstood. I feel like it takes a lot of self-assurance to say to someone who's training you, you're getting this wrong. You need to include something else. I was young when I was trained and really thought I would be a parent. So my eyes were not open while I was listening to our program about, we had lots of training about diversity even. And I think if I had been a little older, I may have thought about it differently. But when I look back, a lot of my professors, supervisors wanted kids and didn't have them. And it didn't even come up as a clinical issue with their identity in the room. And so I feel like it's just this hidden, obscured, topic in the field.
I found that actually even in my training institute, I trained as a child and adolescent psychotherapist, also trained to work with adults, but the majority of my training was as a child and adolescent. And there was a kind of a feeling that, in the group, which was sometimes expressed, that those who didn't have children probably shouldn't be child and adolescent psychotherapists. And also, I had to keep raising the issue of pronatalism within my training institute. And I have to say they did get it in the end. I don't know if it, I'm no longer there, obviously, so I don't know how it might have changed. But I felt that it was not understood as a grief at all. I mean, I realized I was grieving, that my distress over my childlessness was grief when I did my training on bereavement to be a psychotherapist. That's when I went, hang on a minute, this is something I'm experiencing. And a great many people are still finding out that what they are experiencing is grief through the writings of people like us and through my book and through Gateway Women. It's still, it's disenfranchised also within the therapy profession. They don't know it's a grief, and also a living loss, a lifetime, a lifelong living loss. So I think possibly people who specialize in grief counsellors, may be more equipped. But, you know, I saw a lot of therapists and counsellors myself while I was distressed over my childlessness. Not a single one of them named it as grief. I found that out for myself. Yeah.
It's really hard when we have to lead the way.
Mm-hmm.
Our counsellors can't always support us because we're having to educate them. One of the things we were told at university when we were trained to be counsellors, it's not your client's job to educate you about their difference. You have to educate yourself. And what I found with some counsellors, obviously not all, is that it's easier for them to slip into a problem-solving mode with me as a client than to really hear my grief and what's going on. For me, it's easier for them to say things like, well, why don't you try this? And I'm not there for that. I'm not there for problem solving. I'm there to have my grief heard. And I think so it's a long time now since I've gone to counselling for my own personal grief around childlessness. I still remember some of the things that counsellors said to me, and they weren't really able. And again, these are just individuals. I'm not saying this is kids or counsellors, but they weren't really able to hear what was happening for me to deal with it.
Mm.
Can I say that in the approach I'm training in, which is called the IOPT, that's identity-oriented psychotrauma theory, there is actually quite an openness to this, because the idea is that the person who comes for psychotherapy, so we can call it the client, we call it the intention giver, because it's the person who decides what they want to work with, what's the intention of the session. Is supposed to be in charge, and so whatever they want to work with, we accept that is what is causing you distress. So this is what causing you a problem. So whatever it is, so we're not there to judge. So in that sense, I find I really liked this approach, because there is no assessment of how valid your reason for being upset is, and also I was particularly interested in trauma, but the more I learn about trauma, the more I realize that this is so essential to infertility. Not only because some of the procedures that you go through, for example, through IVF and so on, might be traumatizing in themselves, but also because infertility triggers previously traumas that might exist before. So when I talk about the trauma of infertility, I find my colleagues they really understand what I'm talking about. So in that respect, I find my environment where I'm training now quite supportive.
Thank you.
So do you think, Christine, that hearing other people's stories and like the fact that they trained a few years or several years ago, that things have perhaps improved slightly?
I think there are different approaches, and so I think that approaches are all different, and I'm sure they help in different ways. And as I said, I find that this approach is kind of childless friendly from my perspective, because it kind of validates whichever reason is causing you distress, and we start from there. Also, the role of the therapy is not that of an authority, so I'm telling you how to fix you. And I guess as childless, we are used to hear many people who try to fix our pain. And so, mainly also because I don't know anything about my client. I'm just there to provide a safe space. So this approach also believes in the ability for self-healing of the individual. And so we try to facilitate this self-healing to take place.
Mm. I think because of Gateway Women and, because of over a decade of hearing women's stories, either publicly and privately, I feel like a bit of a vault of kind of private information that I've heard over the years. And one of the things that has been, really shocking is that I have heard from women the things that their therapists have said to them. And one of the things I've noticed is that what we call bingos, which are effectively microaggressions, that you can get those in therapy as well. Perhaps the language is slightly more nuanced, but it is actually the same message. I was told, by a therapist that, perhaps on an unconscious level, I didn't really want children. you know, and that was why I hadn't been able to conceive, as well as the, you know, the stuff about, you know, why don't you just adopt? It would be, you know, perhaps my resistance to exploring adoption was because I was ambivalent about, you know, motherhood or something. So it was the same root messages, just kind of in different language, and of course not actually free. You know, and I did one therapist I only saw for a couple of sessions quite late on in my psychotherapy training, so I was able to recognize inappropriate therapy because I was learning what it was meant to be like. I did actually get pretty cross with her and left, and I said, you know, I'm sorry, I can get this shit for free on the street. You know, I don't need to hear it from you. This was someone I did raise a formal complaint about, because I knew that someone else who didn't know what therapy was meant to be wouldn't know that that they weren't getting what they were paying for. And I agree that trauma is, you know, psychotherapy training is very slow to update its kind of methods and modules. It's a very slow process, and I think trauma and the body is a huge part of training that is, people are still qualifying as therapists without really even adequate knowledge of trauma and the body. And as for kind of knowledge of childlessness, it's not even considered as a diversity issue, let alone as a massively defining identity shaping issue. So personally, in my experience, I think the therapy profession has got quite a long way to go with this issue.
Yeah, Jody, I agree. And I'm not surprised to hear from clients ever what they've heard, because I hear it from therapists in public forums when I post about childlessness. The things that they will say, there's a large percentage that are very supportive. I want to acknowledge that. There's also a percentage that say things like anyone can be a parent, period. Child-free, period. Just kind of like totally invalidating what I had just shared in a public forum with their name attached to it, where we have professional communications. And so it's frustrating, it's difficult to see that, but I have so much hope for the people that are supportive or say, I never thought about that. Like, that's the sweet spot. Yes, the people who are maybe already looking at their own bias in other ways, the people that are understanding, deconstructing identities in the rooms with their clients and understanding where they're coming from, may be more open to it. So I have a lot of hope as well as a lot of frustration.
Yeah, I think it's difficult in therapy if you do find that your therapist is holding on to some of the beliefs that you talked about, Jodie. It can be hard to challenge them because there can be a power imbalance in therapy, and you're there to see the therapist who you're giving the role of the expert to, not always, but quite often. And if they say things like that and you then say, well, hang on, I don't see it like that, they can say, well, this is more of your defense. This is more of your, you know, you're just showing me more of your defense and more of your denial of the fact that there are subconscious processes influencing. And it can be very hard to have your voice heard. And I think sometimes the best thing to do is to leave and then to raise that with the professional body that therapist is registered with. Because it can be hard to find your voice in a setting like that. So it's really reassuring to hear that that's what you did, Jodie. You were able to.
Only because I was, you know, I'd been training as a therapist, and you know, I was in supervision, and I knew what I knew what I was getting wasn't right, and I was not just cross for myself, I was cross for the other people that wouldn't know that they weren't getting what they needed. And as you say that, and you know, no one goes to therapy when they're feeling great. No, so the chances of them being in a sort of a space to push back and speak truth to power and all of those things is unlikely. And that made me feel, you know, really, really unhappy. And I also think that the therapy profession does a really lousy job of helping people understand how to find the right therapist. You know, is a lot of stuff is around, you know, explaining different modalities and not really explaining, you know, the kind of questions you're allowed to ask, and how to find a good fit. And, you know, the research has shown over and over again that the most important thing is the relationship. that this is an intimate relationship. It's a professional one, but it's an intimate one.
Yeah.
And you need to feel that fit, you know, that internal yes. And it's, yeah, I mean, that's why I think, you know, seeing a therapist who is themselves childless can be so powerful.
Yeah. So once someone's just made a comment that they said they can't put it in Q&A, saying that they've often been triggered in moments outside of the session. You don't fall over my son's shoes when you leave.
Yeah.
So it can be these small moments outside the session as well that can, you know, when you maybe see, therapist is practicing from home, and you can see signs, you know, people have photographs in their counselling room of their family. So these things can be very, very small.
Without realising how inappropriate and how difficult and how traumatizing that might be, because the unconscious bias again is like, well, this is just normal. This is, you know, this is welcoming. This is normal. I'm inviting you into my home without that awareness of what that might be like. And yeah, I mean, when I was looking for a therapist myself, my last therapist, I wanted to find someone that felt like and strange enough, I found someone who was child-free. So she worked with, I found her because she specialized in working with adoption, but she herself was child-free. And there were lots of kind of things in there. And so I approached her and we had a really frank conversation, you know, in our first few sessions, because I wanted to really find if she could relate to my point of view, as she had chosen not to have children. But because of having worked herself with so many childless couples, because of working in the adoption field, she had a lot of compassion and understanding. And I found that her child-free approach, which could be challenging for me sometimes, but also really developed me, you know. But, you know, there were no children's photos everywhere, and that was important.
Yeah. Absolutely. I really agree with what you said, Jodie, about the relationship and how important that is. And I always say to my clients, quite often, it's really important to me that you get what you came for. And if you're not getting what you came for, please let me know, and we'll try and find a way to either change things, or if I can't give you what you need, I'll tell you, and I'll try and find someone else who can. So just that honesty and straightforwardness about encouraging clients to really get what they came for and talk about what they need, I think is important, particularly in an area like childlessness, where quite often we don't have a voice, or it's not always easy for us to have a voice.
That's my mum's cat, so I'm going to put myself on mute.
It's really interesting to hear from you, and I think you reinforce a lot of thought that I have, that, like you say, you need to find someone who's so trustworthy and actually skilled to be able to guide you in the right direction as well. Going back to originally, Cristina, what we talked about in this, coming up to this webinar and stuff, and saying about triggers that you might have met yourself when you were actually having counselling with the people who are trying to support you through this. Was there one incident or several that sort of came up that you had to sort of question or sort of deal with and give a different perspective back to? Have you lost us, Cristina?
Sorry, did you ask me? I think I lost the audio for a few seconds.
Because you sort of like initiated this conversation, was saying about the triggers that you can come up against during your training and then going into it. Did you find there was one particular one that stood out, or there are several incidents where you've had to sort of say, actually, what you're telling me isn't helpful and you've had to address it?
I mean, I wouldn't tell the intention giver, no, we can't talk about this. But then something I hadn't expected was that I was trying to recruit possible intention givers who had reached the end of their fertility journey, because I really wanted to work on this period after the fertility journey is over and you are facing the perspective of a life without children. So in my ad, I said I wanted to work with these women who were struggling. But it turned out that somebody had decided to stop and then didn't. And so there were also discussions about continuing. And so that I found a challenge to stand in my healthy parts, because as part of our training, we also undergo our own therapy. The point being that once we address our own issues, then we are able to stand and really to provide this safe space without being drawn into the arena ourselves. And so I was really being mindful of how I was reacting. And so I was feeling like at points I was like backwards or being drawn into, but then, and so it was a challenge to stand back. And it was very helpful for me to remind myself that, this is not my process. And so I'm here to facilitate the process. So, I mean, I wouldn't say it was a trigger, but or maybe we can call it a trigger, but it's been a challenging situation. Yes.
Katie, have you found that? Because obviously another thing is that you've been doing it for longer, so you sort of come across these sort of possible triggers as such over a longer period of time, so you've dealt with them differently and stuff. But do you find that as you're healing naturally or finding acceptance of childlessness, that they're not so hard, or you do still get that sort of unexpected moment that makes you pause?
Yeah, I think you're right. Like as you go along and you've done your own healing, you have heard so many other stories, you have seen so many other, clients, and heard from the community that it is less triggering. There are still things that come up, of course. One thing that I talk with clients all the time is, I'm here for you. And some of them know a lot about my story because they've read my website or asked me, and some people don't want to know anything, and that's fine too. And I let them know I take care of myself outside of session with my consult group, with my, any supervision or therapy that I get on my own. And if I notice something comes up for me, I'll deal with it. And so I think, assuring clients of that, but also knowing that I do have resources is what makes, when I feel that little, ooh, that reminds me of my story, it's easier to kind of put that on the shelf in my brain of take care of that later, because I know where to go for it. And I know that I can, continue in relationship with this person. And I think I just see each client is so different. And I'm so interested in hearing their own story, that when something totally resonates with me, sometimes I don't use that either because they're their own person. So
It's like one thing I've noticed is as I'm sort of getting older and accepting it and things like that if I do get a trigger, I'm more likely to go, oh, what was that? Why was that? What did it happen? And I find I analyze things rather than necessarily getting upset by them. And when I can work out why it happened, I can quite often go, okay, I understand that now, and move on. Is that something you find as well as you've or do you deal with it differently? And that's open to anybody who's interested.
I mean, I've been quite fortunate in that I've never really been triggered by my clients' stories. And I think that there's several reasons why that is. I think one in that in person-centered counselling, there's such a huge emphasis on everybody's journey being completely unique. And no two people have had, even if on the surface they've gone through similar experiences, the meaning of that and what that is like for them is so different. But I focus very hard on that with my clients. If there are similarities, then I just remind myself that their journey is completely unique. So that's one thing that really helps me, and it's bred into my training. It's how I train. And I think having really good clinical supervision is important. So you have got somewhere to go if you do find that you're triggered by anything about your client. And I guess one thing that I feel really grateful for is I didn't start working with childless clients until I'd done a lot of my own work. And I was in a place where I felt really able to hold everything that my clients brought to me without getting distressed or triggered by it. Because if I was still in a place where I was, then I wouldn't have considered myself ready for the work. So I'm really glad I had the opportunity to work with Gateway Women and to have a childless network of friends around me who I could really get the support that I needed. So yeah, I've been really glad that I've been able to do this work without finding myself getting upset or triggered by it, and really focusing, as I say, very much on my clients and their uniqueness.
Yeah, I've got a slightly different perspective because I've done much more group work with childless women than I have individual therapy. And I've done both, but I've done, well, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours of sitting in a room with sort of, about 12 women, a lot of it in person, and in the last few years, a lot online. And so I get sort of often asked by the participants, how is this for you? And I think in the like the Reignite weekend, I started it in 2012, and I was getting towards a good place in my grief recovery, but I wasn't completely sort of out of the woods. And it wasn't so much that I would get triggered, but rather that like a little thread of someone's story would sort of tug on a thread of my own. And it just sort of felt that it was like an opportunity for more healing for me in that moment, to have it tugged rather than it being traumatic, because, like Katie and Meryl said, I had a place to take my own stuff. And, part of the training of a therapist is almost to develop the capacity to have two minds going at once. One mind that is completely with what's happening in the client, and another mind that is noticing what's happening in your own mind in response to what you're seeing to the client. And you sort of learn to go, okay, well, that's really interesting, I'll look at that later. Or goodness, isn't it interesting how it's woken that old memory up? I wonder why that is. And that can be actually really useful information, because what it can be sometimes, and this is not an either or, is there can be a sense that if part of your story or your pain is woken up in response to something, there might be some information in that about what's happening for the client that even they might not be aware of yet. Their unconscious might be talking to your unconscious. So actually it can be really interesting to have your own story get activated in different ways. And I never found being in the room and working with childless women anything other than an incredible privilege. It was never traumatizing for me. And to a point in the chat, and what Katie said about people reading the website, I've been an open book for over a decade. There's probably not much that people don't know about me. And I think to the point about self-disclosure in therapy, when I was working with childless clients, I did self-disclose sometime, but the key rule is whose need is being met here? Am I talking about this because suddenly I need to talk about it? Because that's not appropriate. That's for me to take to therapy. But if there is a small amount of information I can disclose that the purpose is to maybe assist them, it's a fine line to walk. There's a reason why, therapists are trained not to self-disclose. But I did find with childless clients, and I alluded to this in the beginning, that my childlessness was really important to them. My story was really important to them. But I found that as they really got into their therapy, my story became less and less important to them. But I think it was quite holding for them at the beginning to know that they were talking to someone who really got it. And they sort of had proof of that because they'd read my book or they'd read articles, but it became less important as they kind of opened up. Yeah. I don't know, I'd be fascinated. I've never spoken to another childless therapist. I'd be fascinated to know if you've noticed that shift yourself, maybe.
I've definitely noticed that, Jody. I think that, it is very much, I even hear from people who come to therapy for an entirely different issue and just happen to be childless, not by choice. And they have said, this appeals to me to work with you because I just want to be in the room with someone like me. And that's a beautiful thing. And my story never comes up at all. And so I think you've got that all the way up to someone who really wants to know, who, isn't quite sure I'm going to understand them. And there's a lot of relationship building and trust building there. And you're right, it does fall away. And occasionally things will come up and say, like, did that ever happen to you? And I'll say like, do you really need to know my story, or would you like to hear from, you know, things I've heard in the community? And I love to give people just a breadth of things that I've heard from other people as well, and kind of take it off from what I know to be true in my story, because I'm just one person.
Yeah, can I say that also the women I'm working with, they started to work with me because they knew that I would understand what they were talking about, and because they had bad experiences perhaps with previous therapists. But I wanted to go back also to the point of the healing, because I also find doing the therapy is healing for me as well. And in fact, when I find these resonances that perhaps kind of stir something in me, as Stephanie was saying, I become quite curious as to, okay, why is this happening? Why does this resonate with me? Why am I suddenly sad? Or why this feeling? And actually, as part of my training, so I try to feel it, because that enables me perhaps to integrate small layers of something that was hidden, I wasn't aware of. And so I find like, the therapy becomes healing also for myself. And there are smaller bits of my experience that I can integrate thanks to this. So I find it rewarding, because I feel I'm helping other people, but these people are helping me as well. So I feel it's great.
I wonder what you think. And it's sort of coming up in the chat as well. I think that childlessness, perhaps rather like LGBT counselling, gender transitioning counselling, substance abuse counselling, there are certain areas of counselling and therapy where it is accepted and understood practice, this kind of that the counsellor will have lived experience of the issue. And my sense is that childlessness is perhaps one of those, but I'd love to know what others think.
I was about to say that I think there is a parallel with LGBTQ+ counselling. I might choose to see an LGBTQ+ counsellor not to talk about what it's like for me to be gay, but just so I know that there's a shared language and a shared understanding, and I don't need to explain the language or the words I use or the community that I live in. I don't need to explain it, because that person also lives in that community.
Yeah.
So I do think there's a parallel there. And I actually also think that sometimes as a childless person, you have to come out. And sometimes you have to come out several times as a childless person. If you start a new job, you have to come out as a childless person, and make a new friend. And it can be the same with being gay or trans or non-binary. Sometimes you have to keep repeatedly coming out. So I think there are some parallels. And I was just thinking about what you said, Christina, I think it's you or Katie, about how it's helped your own healing. And one of the things I've noticed is being able to use my experience to work with other childless people does give me a sense of meaning. You know, there was some meaning in my experience. But yes, the point you just made, Jodie, I think there is something in that. That just, even if you're talking about something completely different, not childlessness at all, just having that shared understanding of what it's like to be in that community.
Yeah, if you know the concept of wounded healer, which I think when people hear it, they think of somebody walking around with an injury and they can't quite help someone else, but it's actually just the opposite. And I just think of it as being human, right? The fact that we've gone through very similar things makes us have more empathy and, you know, more openness towards what our clients may be bringing, and recognizing that in ourselves. There was a question in the chat that I'm noticing about, is it really necessary, from Julia, to totally heal ourselves before we're working? Is it possible to be going through grief while, you know, seeing childless people? What is that like? And I think acknowledging that childless loss / grief is lifelong. We're going to be going through it. And I did, you know, like I reckoned with my childlessness while I was working, not specifically with calling myself a childless counselor, but working with people who wanted kids and couldn't have them. And there I was, and also working with parents and children. And, you know, I found a way to make it work. And I think just being very mindful of my caseload and how much of one topic I was taking on was the most helpful thing.
Can I answer the question about whether you need to heal yourself first? And I think, okay, while we will all carry this grief for the whole of our life, but I think we have achieved a level of healing that makes so that we can deal with the pain of others without being swayed, and being thrown off by it. And I think that's absolutely essential. And for example, in my perspective, because I'm trying to deal with the trauma. And so that's why it's important that the person who comes to me defines what they want to work on. And I don't suggest what they do, because if I do, I might lead them to be re-traumatized, because they might get themselves into something that is too painful for them to handle. And so if I haven't healed myself, then there's a possibility that I'm too eager maybe to help. So because I know their pain and I want to stop their pain, and so I want to do something, and that might mess up completely the process. While I need to stand back, I just need to provide the space. I need to, let them work on what they want to work and facilitate the process. So I find if I'm not healed enough, then I actually put at risk the person I'm working with.
Interesting.
Yeah. There's this lovely book called Trauma Stewardship. I have it right here. It's written by Laura Vandernoot-Lipsky and Connie Burke, and it talks a lot about this trauma response cycle that we may have as therapists, and it's for anybody who's caring for others. So first responders, it's really written for everybody, and I'll put it in the chat in a minute. But it does talk about this idea of like, one of the responses is like, I try to do everything, or I'm overeager, or I'm taking things on, and that can be so rewarded in our profession. Right? That idea of like, I'm going to be so invested. And I think starting to see where we do get kind of like triggered and really thinking about like, well, why am I doing this? What is my role here? And is this serving me in a way that I can serve others, or is it triggering me into a place of not being able to connect? And the book does a great job of giving suggestions about how to center yourself and really check in on. So I recommend that all the time.
There was a question earlier in the Q&A box from someone who is a therapist herself, saying, working, as you say, with clients who are perhaps in that difficult space between, am I going to be childless or am I not? That very painful, still hopeful space, but also working with pregnant clients. And I haven't worked with a pregnant client. I don't know what that would be like. I have to say that when I read that, there was a part of me went, I kind of, I felt my soul slightly contract at the thought. And I thought, yeah, that's probably not easy. Is that something any of us have worked with?
3 times I've worked with clients who are in that ambivalent state, and they have got pregnant while we were working together. And I've always been very clear with them. I would continue to, if they're in that still trying space, I've always been really clear. I would continue to work with them if they got pregnant, for as long as they felt they needed it. So I have done that, but with a few clients now. It's a huge number. When you're working with clients who are still trying, then that might happen.
Yeah, I know another therapist, a childless therapist, who's been worked in that space, and quite a few of her clients have then made the decision that they do want to have children, ambivalent clients, and quite a few of them have got pregnant. And she's described it as actually being almost, for her, it almost feels like a form of like spiritual midwifing. She feels almost like she's been part of the process, and it's been quite a transformative healing experience for her. Yeah,
I'd agree with that. I having the having the willingness to keep working with these clients while they were pregnant, and to feel like I'd somehow positively contributed towards their situation in whatever way, did feel really profoundly beautiful, actually. And I was really glad that I'd had that opportunity to be part of that journey with them.
Yeah.
Really interesting for me to be able to sit back and listen to the conversations that you're coming up, because you raise so many questions, but you also give so many answers as well. But one thing I was thinking of, because obviously, like you, Jodie, I'm involved with support groups and community that way. I've never gone for one-on-one counselling or anything like that. It's not been something I've been drawn to or felt I've needed. What do you think is the difference between group counselling, if you could sort of say, through support groups and individual? Because for me, I think listening to what you're saying, almost like being in a sort of a support group, it's you're hearing everybody, and sometimes your own emotions get inflamed or they can be calmed down and they're all over the place. But one-on-one, it becomes about you, and that's where I assume everybody goes deeper.
Strange enough, I think sometimes it's amazing how deep people can go in a group setting. I think particularly, you know, a therapeutic group setting where, you know, there are boundaries and it's clear and you're kind of there to do that work. Because actually also groups have this very, very powerful unconscious thing that happens, which is that all groups also unconsciously evoke our original group, our family. So actually it can really kick off all kinds of incredibly powerful, productive material can arise in a group setting that might not arise in a one-to-one setting. So, and I think also, I think the power of peer-to-peer healing is something that cannot be underestimated. When I set up Gateway Women originally, it was also, you know, I was coming out of the back of having had incredible healing through the 12-step movement. I'd been in a group called Al-Anon, which is for friends and families of alcoholics and addicts. And I'd seen the power of peer-to-peer healing, and that nobody needed to be healed and nobody needed to be an expert, but that there were very, very clear boundaries and rules about how we did that work together. And I brought that into kind of the Gateway Women community. And it is, you know, it's an incredibly powerful way. I mean, in a way, it's probably the first form of healing, is sitting in a circle in a safe space, sharing, you know. So there are probably things that it would be very hard to bring up in a group. I think shame, you know, which is by its nature intensely private, it would be really, really difficult to work with like that, because it's actually even really difficult to work with it one-to-one. Yeah, so there's going to be a mix of all of them is probably a good idea. Yeah.
I think there's power, as you say, as an individual, in a contained group, in a group that's a bit wild and just saying how they're free, because you get to sort of express every little part of you if you want to. And I think that is a great freedom that can, you know, it can help release so many emotions. So is there something you would all say, if you could give one word of advice, or not necessarily a word of advice, or something that you would suggest to people to perhaps help them? Is there something that comes to mind that you would like to share?
There's people posting in the Q&A about how do you find the right.
That's what I would talk about too.
Yeah.
Go for it.
How do you find the right counsel for you? I mean, Jodie, obviously, you know, chip in, because I think the only way to really find whether someone's the right counsel for you, in my opinion, is to have a talk with them. Is to I offer my clients a phone call, which is absolutely free and no obligation, just to chat to me so we can find out if we're a good match. And so they can get a sense of who I am and what it's like to work with me, and then they can decide whether I'd be a good match for them. So I think that's my advice about how to find the right counsellor for you, is just be willing to chat to a few people until you find somebody who you think, yes, that's somebody who I think I can relate to, because it is a relationship, as you were saying earlier, Jodie. It's a really important relationship. It's a boundary, professional relationship, but nonetheless, it's one where two people are meeting in a space, and it's a powerful meeting. It can be. So yeah, being willing to chat to a few people and find someone who feels right for you, I think really matters. So that's the advice I would give to people who are trying to find a therapist, and ask around if you know other childless people.
I was going to say, because if somebody's not willing to talk and they're not willing to try and connect with you, then obviously you know that's a no when you cross them off the list, because they should be open with you.
And if they don't want to disclose whether they have children or not, and they don't understand why that issue is so important to you as a childless person, they've already answered your question. Now, obviously, you know, some therapists are trained not to give away any information about themselves at all. But you still might go into their house and there are, as you say, children's shoes in the hallway. That's giving away information in my book. So actually on the Gateway Women website, if you go to resources and you go to finding a therapist or counsellor, there's actually a link there to a piece that I wrote about how to find a therapist. And it kind of, one of the things I would say is, you know, as Muriel said, make appointments, have those initial chats. In a way, I know it's a bit like dating. You might need to meet a few. You might even want to, and this is what's really difficult because of that power imbalance and how terrible you might be feeling when you seek a therapist. It's okay to say, I'd like to do if you find someone you want to work with, it's okay to say, I'd like to do 6 sessions. And then for us to kind of see whether, you know, whether we're a really good fit. And because that's okay. It's okay to ask for that. But clients often don't know. And it might be that at that point, you're really ready to commit to an open-ended, you know, series of sessions. That can be really hard too. But also in my experience, like as Katie was saying, because I was training to be a therapist, I had to be in therapy, and it was a long process. My training was 5-6 years. So, and I really noticed the difference being in therapy for a long period of time, the difference between therapy of a year, which is often, you know, to help you with certain symptoms or a certain situation, a therapy that goes 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. I hate to say it, but if you're with the right person and it goes that long, it is transformative, really transformative, but it's expensive. And I guess therapists don't really want to let you know how much better it can be if you are able to work with them for that long. But you know, it is an accessibility and a finance issue, and that's also something that all societies are struggling with. That mental health support, you know, is impacted by how much you've got in your wallet, and it makes me very, very cross. But that, I'll put that in the "don't get me started" box.
Yes.
This link off you later as well, Jodie, so I can add it to the website.
Yeah.
Do the webinar, do the book that you've mentioned as well,
Yeah.
Kate. Are there any set questions then that people could ask or should ask? Because sometimes when you're put on the spot, you forget what to say, and you go away and think, I wish I'd asked that. Do you include that in your sort of the blog that you've written, or is there something you could say now about that?
There's a little bit about that in the piece that I wrote, but I think actually the blog that Muriel wrote, was it for Therapy Today?
Or Psychology Today,
something
or
like
something. Shall I try and find it?
That is so good, because even if you share that with a prospective therapist, their response to that is going to tell you so much. Yeah.
I've written a little thing too, because people would approach, and I'm literally the only person that pops up sometimes, and I'm only licensed in my state. And so I'd let people know, like, okay, well, here's some things to ask. Like, I feel so bad about sending them away. Like, so I realized I was kind of saying the same things over and over. And one of the first things you can know is that any question you have for a therapist is okay to have.
Yeah.
You're allowed to wonder anything, and you're allowed to say, hey, when we have a bump about childlessness, how should I bring it up to you? To kind of prime yourself and to prime that person for the fact that it's going to happen. And when it does, what are we going to do? And then it kind of takes a little bit of the power down. There are all kinds of other things people wonder, you know, like, if you're also childless, are you going to be able to understand me? Or, you know, if I went through IVF and you didn't, are we going to get it? You know, like, there's anything that you're wondering is really okay to ask.
Can I say that there is something about being childless, you know, after having been through failures and so on. I mean, this makes a dent in your self-esteem, and you feel like, yeah, as we know very well, perhaps you're worth less. So I think that leads you not to ask the questions, but really we need to think, you know, my well-being is my first priority, and I need to know about things in order to make myself well. And I think it's important to be aware that there is this kind of starting point that, we tend to internalize from all the messages we receive from around us. But then, maybe we can try and actively oppose it. And again, as I said, make our well-being our first priority. And we need to ask questions. We need to have answers.
We again, when I was training to be a counsellor, you know, we were taught a lot about personal disclosure, and it's not a blanket rule that you never do it. You know, it is about thinking about, who is this for? Why am I going to make this disclosure? And one of the things I've often said is, I will tell you, So you take the anxiety away from the client because you tell them that you will answer the question. But I'd like to know, what would it mean for you if I said that I had done IVF? What would it mean for you if I said that I haven't done IVF? So you explore that question with them. You take the anxiety away by saying, I will answer it. And also, so they don't think they've done something wrong in asking you a question. It's really important that we don't shame our clients, add to the shame that our clients have got by not bringing our humanity into the work, actually. And the fact that we have had both similar and different experiences because of our childlessness. I love the bit in your book, JD, where it says 50 ways not to be a mother. You know, we know that there are so many more than 50, but it's a really good starting point for thinking of the diversity that we bring to childlessness, our own unique, but still our paths do converge and cross.
And recognizing that it's an intersectional issue, childlessness, you know, rather than some sort of discrete medical issue. I think it's really important that we understand that, and that we keep opening, our own minds and discovering our own biases. For me, working within the childless field has been and continues to be an incredible education for me. Also, what I don't know and what I don't understand. I'm not the expert. I'm not the childless Google. Which is what I sometimes tell people. It's each of us is having our own unique experience.
Yeah.
We've come into this room together because of childlessness, but we're so different.
Yeah, absolutely. And bearing in mind our clients' unique mixture. It was called in one book I read, your clients have a unique mixture, as do you. And bearing really, being open to every aspect of that unique mixture that your clients have. Someone asked earlier in the chat about trans people and bringing their experience into childlessness. Again, I think that's really important, to listen to the experiences of trans people as well, and to listen to the experiences of everybody with an open mind and an open heart. As when people come to us for counselling, or just in general conversation, people we might meet.
Wow, thank you so much, ladies. I think, like you say, the final message is listening, which is what you do. You listen, and that's what we do, is we listen to each other and our stories, and that's where you help, purely by listening. And it is for those people who are looking for someone to find someone who they feel they can talk to, and they'll listen without judgment. And that's all we really want so much of the time. So I know we could go on for longer. I think we should close it, but thank you so much. So Cristina, Jodie, Katie, Mary, it's been wonderful that you've joined me for this conversation. I love being able to sit back and just let you chat and speak to the people in the, through the chat box and stuff. So thank you so much. And yeah, good night for tonight, ladies.
Could I just say, if you haven't answered anybody's question, I don't mind I know there are questions you haven't answered. I'm happy to be emailed. You can get my email via my website. I know someone had a question about online counselling, which I think is a really good one. But again, if you haven't answered your question, then please do try and contact us another way.
Oh, yeah.
And yeah, I'd like to thank you, Steph, for setting up this opportunity for us to talk as well.
Thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure to sit in the company of my sister therapists as well. It's really, I don't get to do that very often. It's been really special for me to be a part of this. Thank you, Steph, Mariel, Katie, and Cristina. Thank you.
It's been lovely.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Good to
much.
see you all.
Everyone.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.